Hey, this is Odd Rocker from the Audio Discourse Music channel. I thought I would come on here and talk about a video that I recently saw. This video has something to do with Gavin McInnis. Yes, that Gavin McInnis, Proud Boys Gavin McInnis. He recently did a video on the A+J's tribute to black punk rockers. And of course, he had something to say because anytime that black people talk about their contributions, he always has to spit at that and say like just really spiteful things. First of all, I'm gonna also say this: punk did not begin in the UK. Punk and hardcore began in the US. That's obvious. That's history. We can talk about this another time, and if you want, I'll even do a video on it. Man. Anyway, another thing I will also say, Joan Jett is more important to punk rock than he's even letting on. A woman that has had Steve Jones and Paul Cook in her band, let alone the guys from Rick L. Rick, which is an old punk band from the West Coast, let alone produce the first Germs album. She is associated with punk rock. I'm sorry. No, I'm not sorry. Anyway, we got that out of the way. The first thing that Gavin does is talk about how, A+J injects race into punk rock. First of all, he says this, but at the same time contradicts himself by basically race baiting, talking about black people needing white people, like the Jamaicans are basically they needed white people and all this, and that's why they moved over there, when that's so dumb and untrue. Like, the Jamaicans ended up in the UK because they were invited to fight the World War II, and a lot of them were also helping to build the infrastructure over there. Just silly. Then he had the nerve to bring this propaganda, that Soodlander propaganda about blacks killing white people in South Africa, when there's even white people that talk about how totally untrue that is, and how it's not what these race baiting people like himself, it's nothing like that. That's another subject. And if you want to talk about people injecting race into punk rock, this stuff has been dealt with earlier on. Lester Bangs wrote a great article about how the early punk scene was when it even came to black people. Don't think that punks are exempt from being racist. Oh, before I mention that, he also mentioned how punk was a bunch of white punk rockers fighting against Nazi skinheads. So already he's contradicting himself in that video a ton of times when when he's talking about injecting race into it. He does it the whole time. But getting back to the Lester Bangs article, he talked about how, he was playing some soul music and some guy was saying, "Why are you playing that nigger music?" Stuff like that. Or talked about basically how Nico from the Velvet Underground had a lot of racist things to say about black people. And not only that, he even talked about himself and things that he said, and how Ivan Julian, a black punk rocker, I'm going to talk about him later, from the Voidoids, basically, and how he felt about what Lester Bangs said and how he felt about him. So, I thought it was a great article that Lester wrote, and it talked about even how that stuff was, it's like, hey, even if we have this scene, there's still a lot of, it's no different from regular society. These foundational things that have been built when it comes to this race issue still exist even in punk rock. That's what he was saying. And I thought it was a very interesting article that he wrote. It's been reprinted and put in other books and all that. I like the fact that he even looked at his own self and how he contributed to it. And not being proud of it, obviously. But yeah, this has been an issue. Shoot, you had people, I grew up hearing that, oh, white I'm sorry, punk was the whitest form of music and all that stuff. You know, even though there's been black people in punk rock even from the beginning. I'm gonna get to that list. You know, Johnny Ramone talking about, you know, his guitar is like the whitest, you know, form of rock and roll, and how there's no blues injected, which is silly because, I mean, I'm hearing the same thing that, you know, somebody like Bo Diddley, you know, or Chuck Berry is doing. You know, I still hear the same thing. You know, I mean, even it's funny. The band Death never even heard who freaking like Johnny Ramone was when they were recording their stuff. They recorded it before the Ramones. It's a segueing even into talking about Death. And they still had chords like that on songs like Freaking Out. Totally reminds me of like The Damned, you know, or something like that. And it was out before The Damned or the Ramones. So that supposedly being the whitest form of rock and roll, I think not. It's rock and roll. Punk is rock and roll, you know, without all the BS. It's back to the basics, you know, the way that rock and roll should be. And that comes, that brings up Death. He makes this comment as if they had nothing in common with a lot of those bands, like, you know, Rocket from the Tombed, the Dead Boys, freaking like the Voidoids. I mean, dude, you could still see the similarities between them and Death. We could argue that all of them were rock bands. When you listen to a song like Freaking Out or Where Do We Go From Here, I can't compare that to freaking Alice Cooper, dude. Yeah, they were influenced by that, but that was something. Put it like this. Yes, we can talk about the MC5 and the Stooges, and you know, he made comments about them not being punk. I disagree with that. They probably weren't labeled that, but they were definitely like the beginnings of a lot of that stuff. But when it comes to Death, they had that sound, but a lot of their songs were short and to the point. Even with the leads that you hear, yeah, you can call them a rock band or whatever, but punk rock is rock and roll, no matter what. Even a lot of the bands back then, you could look at some of these interviews, that's how they're described. I mean, the fans are even describing it as just rock and roll with no BS. And it's just silly because, like, this guy's trying to take away how the similarities that band Death had with a lot of those bands. I think if Death was in the right place at the right time, they would be regarded in a different way in history. And I'm glad that somebody actually did find their stuff and saw the similarities between them and other bands that were playing the same thing at the same time. So I think it's really funny and dismissive for him to even say that they didn't have anything that sounded punk. That's silly. That's really silly. You know, I mean, man. And then he had the nerve to talk about, like, well, heck, if you want to go there, Alice Cooper is also known as the godfather of punk, you know? But they don't sound anything like the Who or Alice Cooper. They sound more similar to something like the Ramones or the Dead Boys or any of those bands like that, you know? Back then, punk wasn't as defined. But moving on from Death, there's another band which, you know, I thought should have been mentioned more, that was around back then, and they were in the right place at the right time. That band is Pure Hell. And by the way, Gavin, if you see this, one of the members from Pure Hell that I'm actually friends with would like to talk to you, if you're into that. Pure Hell, they're from Philly and probably one of the first of the bands that were punk from there. They played in New York a lot. They were cool with the New York Dolls. Like they were friends with those dudes, and they would play with those guys like a lot. I mean, they played the Mud Club, they played CBGB's, they played Max's Kansas City. They went to the UK, played over there with the first wave of a lot of those British punk rockers. They played even like, you know, the Mask. The Mask was the first punk club in LA. You know, They played actually like The Mask on their last show, actually, from what I know, and that was in a different venue. But that's just amazing that this band had all that history, you know. And they had some unfortunate things happen to them because, like, their manager kind of really messed them up. But those guys were pretty much known, like, and I take I love when I find underground bands, like, and that's how I found them. They were in a punk rock book, actually. And I'm like, who are these guys? And yeah, Pure Hell, I mean, shoot, they were friends with Lemmy, too. I mean, he produced one of their albums, like, I mean, man. A few of the members in Pure Hell went to do a band called Bad Actor. It was Tex Mosley who ended up in the band with, speaking of Rick Elrick, and Spider. Actually, him and Spider were in Bad Actor. But, shoot. I can go on and on about this. And Pure Hell definitely, like, they were punk rock, dude. That album, Noise Addiction, is one of not only my favorite punk rock albums, but my favorite all-time rock and roll albums. Just sick and just no BS and straightforward. Some would even say they were proto-hardcore. I don't know. They were definitely like that album is non-stop. It's just fast driving. Moving on, he talks about the Bad Brains, saying that they were opportunists and all this BS. They were doing what they wanted to do. It had nothing to do with being opportune. Punk rock was not like it's not like it is now, dude. Like, a lot of that stuff was looked down on back then. And if you dug it, you dug it. Those guys were in the jazz fusion and what people called doomsday music, or Daryl said doomsday music, which was the hard rock heavy metal of that time. Sabbath and Budgie and all those bands. And they were in the funk, and they pretty much, their friend Sid McRae turned them on to this music that was very high energy. They liked it and wanted to do their own version of it, which ended up pretty much being hardcore. They're definitely one of the forebearers of that. And one of the first people that, people think of, which, I see Gavin gave them props, but at the same time, he had to have some snide remark about them being opportunists. Like, how are they opportunists if they're just doing what they want? Especially the kind of stuff that they played. I mean, if they were that much of an opportunist, they could have did Stay Close to Me on all their songs, but they chose not to. They chose the more faster, louder, and harder edge sounds of punk rock, which they pretty much ended up inventing hardcore punk rock. So that's just a bunch of BS to me, Another thing that he totally failed on was reggae. Him saying that it had nothing to do with punk rock in a greater scheme, that's silly. That's totally silly. Saying that it had a minimal influence, that's a lie. That's a total lie. Punk and reggae were kind of allies, Many of those people were into the ska stuff. People like John Lydon talked about how he grew up listening to reggae music. His parents had that in their collection, sorry. Ja Wobble talked about it. I mean, yes, you can say Don Letts introduced a lot of kids to that stuff, but a lot of kids grew up around, certain West Indian. It depends on where you were, from what I understand. You had a lot of skinheads back then, in the late 60s into reggae as well. So it's not like Don Letts, was like the only way a lot of people heard it, even though he was an influence on that. Yeah, man, like, shoot. It's just, okay. Another thing that I have to mention, speaking of Don Letts, he was the first, he was definitely important to a lot of punk rock too, because he was the one that made actually the first movie about UK punk rock, called The Punk Rock Movie. I saw that, like, and it was, you see everybody in that movie. Shoot. The Pistols, The Clash, even Shane McGowan, from, what's the name of that Irish punk band? How could I forget his band? I'm not going to say the other band's names that he was in, because I don't want to I don't want to say that name, but yeah, I mean, everybody was in that movie, man, and it was a good thing. He went on to do even other movies that had to do with punk rock, like, it's just, come on, dude. Yeah, I mean, he was also in Basement 5, it was a post-punk band, and which, another thing I was going to bring up, almost forgot, was that, like, a lot of post-punk had a lot of reggae influences. Bauhaus, the pop group, the Slits, Scritti Politti, A Certain Ratio, like, they all used a lot of that. I mean, I'm just naming a few, and dub itself had a lot of influence as well. I mean, you had even a lot of these punk bands doing, like, dub mixes, like the band Sex Gang Children had songs that, I remember listening to a song that they had the regular, but then they had the dub mix. That was all reggae influence, man. Like, seriously. Shoot. And then, of course, the black funk influence and all that, with a lot of those post-punk bands as well. I mean, you can't deny a lot of the black history in punk rock. And this brings up another story. When it comes to black contribution, I mentioned Don Letts. I mentioned a few others, but first of all, let's get this thing with polystyrene out of the way. Polystyrene, to me, like, I already knew that she was, like, I've been knowing that. Just because you found out, Gavin, recently, doesn't mean that, like, it was never known. A lot of people like myself took note of that because of people in the media talking about how, like, whites, pretty much punk is their music. So like what you said, you're punk rock. Well, it's my punk rock too. We had a lot of things that have to do with it, and we were there since the beginning. I mean, you got Pure Hell, you got people like Neon Leon, you got cats like, Pat Smear from the Germs, you got Vaginal Cream Davis, Tequila Mockingbird, man, she basically, like, she pretty much has the punk museum. She's the one that got that going. And before that, she was doing new wave theater. She bought a lot of punk bands on that. Her and Pete Ivers did that show back in the early 80s. And I mean, you had bands like X and Fear and, lesser known bands like Panic. You had bands like 45 Grave, and the list goes on. She brought a lot of that punk element to it because a lot of what they were playing was more the lighter new wave stuff. But she brought a lot of those bands, like a lot of the bands that I'm listing on there. She was a promoter in the early days too, for a long time. And she's done a lot for the punk scene in LA, and even from what I understand in New York too. And I guess she's from Boston. But yeah, Tequila Mockingbird, freaking Ivan Julian, Voidoids, like he was the Voidoids guitarist. Skeeter Thompson, you mentioned him, him and Dave Grohl were in the Scream. Tony Young, DC punk rocker, may she rest in peace, had a lot to do with the DC scene, booking shows and all that, and a lot of things, like just Dave Byers, who was in a bunch of different bands from DC, like Peer Pressure, Red Sea. He was in HR's band too at one point. Freaking Gerald Collins from the Algebra Mothers. There's a long list, dude. Like Frida Rente. I mean, shoot, Frida Rente was the first black woman on MTV. She was in the band Lipstick and Zarkins with the members of the Alley Cats. Barry Adamson from the band Magazine. The dude, pretty much him and Mick Karn pioneered that bass style of that sort of fretless, sort of distorted playing. And he had more distortion. Mick, I don't think he used really much distortion, but Barry used distortion when it came to his fretless bass. And I thought it was really cool too, because a lot of bands, like a lot of post-punk and goth bands, still have that style, they use that style a lot. Sean Brown, freaking, man, Jacko from freaking Why Die, and the drummer, I think his name is Twig. There's so many, I could talk about this stuff all day, like I said before. Darren Peligro from the Dead Kennedys, you know, like freaking Orlando X from Special Forces. I mean, man, dude, there's a lot. I mean, there's a long list, you know. Shoot, Herbert Kent, you know, like he had a punk rock radio station called Punk Out in Chicago. He just passed, actually, I think, like earlier this year. And there's a lot more. I actually have a hashtag thing called the Black History of Punk. Oh, also something else. I didn't want to forget mentioning Sasha Jenkins. Gavin talks about how he knows this dude. Nah, I don't think you know this dude. Sasha Jenkins has been into punk since the 80s. Him and Chaka Malik from Burn. Also, Chaka played in Orange 9mm, but Burn was like a hardcore that he was in. They would go to shows and stuff together. They've been friends, you know. I think he even knew Dingy from, I think, what's his name? Dingy from Absolutions. That was an all-black. Well, actually, the lead singer was he was the lead singer of Absolution. Sorry about that. But Sasha, I mean, he's played in punk bands even before 1865. You're saying that you know him, and you don't even, like, if you did know Sasha Jenkins, you would know that he's been into punk rock for a long time and would go to CBGBs and all that. How I even found out about him was through punk rock, you know, him repping punk rock. So, you know, him just dismissing Sasha again because he's not happy with people talking about their issues. He's one of those people that like to live in denial of what black people go through. You know, it's just such a stupid thing, man. Like, and ignorant, very, very ignorant. You know, he wants to deny stuff that black people face. I mean, there's movies like Afropunk that even talked about, and I don't mean the festival. You know, the original movie of Afropunk talked about a lot of these same issues. You know, I do believe that the festival is far removed from what it was from the beginning, but that's a different story. The original, I mean, I'm a part of that collective from Los Angeles collective. So, you know, we're the earlier versions of the ones that were on the message boards and talking about a lot of stuff and stuff like that, you know. So I just feel that Gavin was very dismissive when it came to blacks in punk rock and our contribution. And also that he has like this thing where he just wants to crap on black people no matter what, all the time, you know, like it's so bad that we mention our contributions to anything. And of course he's going to talk about how, you know, dysfunctional black people are and his whole white supremacist ideology, you know, like we actually need white people and all this stuff and how we'll run the white people and all this BS, you know. So yeah, man, I thought I would like come on here and just talk about this stuff. And, you know, if you really want to know more about the Black History of Punk, check out the Black History of Punk or the Black History of Rock and Roll, period. You know, I go into detail, and I might even do another video specifically on the Black History of Punk, going all the way back to Jump Blues, which had a lot of influence on that, you know, and then going to Bo Diddley, you know, like, and man, the list goes on. So I'll talk to you guys later. And hey, peace. Here they are, Gavin, with a head full of hair. Yeah, they have more hair than I do. No balding at all. But then again, you're the same guy that says the Ramones were rockabilly. Anyways. Yes, one thing I forgot to mention is in talking about punk, yes, I'm aware there's very much avant-garde influences and all kinds of stuff, but I specifically focused on that original sort of rock and roll sound within punk rock when talking about Death and the Ramones and all those bands. So yeah, I'm going to say that there's a lot of elements of experimentation within punk rock. You know, we can talk about even the Residents being part of that and all these different bands like Suicide and stuff and the Screamers, but that's a whole nother subject. I just thought I would be specific about that too, because punk just laid another foundation, not only for the rock and roll elements, but also less rock and roll elements and more avant-garde type stuff that was kind of out there, infusing even, elements of jazz and classical with it. Anyways, I thought I would come and mention that.